Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 151, the 1924 Washington Senators, a team of destiny. Yes, they were a team of destiny. And joining me on today's show is author Gary Sarnoff, who recently wrote a book about this incredible team, aptly named A Team of Destiny. And we are going to take a look back at so much about the 1924 Washington Senators, including their young player manager, Bucky Harris, the incredible comeback of their legendary pitcher, Walter Johnson, and the climb to the top of the baseball world. So much to discuss. So I want to get straight into today's show, but first, a little housekeeping. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook, and please hit that like and subscribe button as well. And hey, if you have a question or comment and want to reach out to me, please shoot me an email at sportsfh.info@gmail.com. That's sportsfh.info@gmail.com. And as always, I thank you for your support. Okay, let's get into today's show with my guest, author Gary Sarnoff. Hey, Gary, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad to have you aboard.
Thank you very much, Warren. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, this should be fun. We're going to talk about a subject, a team that many don't remember. Baseball historians will certainly recall the 1924 Washington Senators, but they have such a unique history. Washington baseball has such a unique history, and that's where I really want to start this. Perhaps you can give us a little reminder, a little history about baseball in Washington, D.C., who the original Senators were, the name, the Nationals, the Minnesota Twins, the Texas Rangers, the Montreal Expos. Why don't you give us a little history about baseball, Major League Baseball in Washington, D.C.?
Okay, to tell the truth, though, a lot of people may not know this, but Washington in the 1890s was a National League team, and they were the Senators, and they were owned by the Wagner brothers, who were not very popular because they treated their players as if they were stocks. Whenever a player got good, they sold them off. Okay, so because they did this, because they sold off their good players, they didn't have much talent, and the team was never good. So here they were in the National League, finishing light years out of first place, way down in the standings in the 1890s. So after the 1899 season, when the National League decided to contract from 12 to 8 teams, it was not a surprise that the Washington Senators were one of the 4 teams that they contracted. So Washington went without baseball for a year. They wouldn't have to wait long because in 1901 came the founding of the American League, and 8 new teams. One of the new teams was the Washington Senators. So Washington had baseball back. They were the Senators. And like the team of the 1890s in the National League, they were not very good. So in 1905, before the 1905 season, someone got the message. Someone made a good point saying, hey, listen, I think it's the name Senators because the Senators mean Wagner brothers of the old Senators of the National League, and that means losing baseball. So they decided on a name change. So they had a contest for a new name, and the name Nationals was picked. However, some sports writers, some fans were traditionalists. They were not okay with this. They wanted the Senators. However, the team name and the colors, for that matter, have been changed to the Nationals. So here they were, the Washington Nationals, but because some people objected to that and insisted on calling them the Senators, the 2 names are used interchangeably. So that's why if you look at old newspapers or old programs, it'll be the Senators or the Nationals. The Nationals or the Senators. So here they were, called the Senators, but actually the Nationals, playing in the American League. They continued to lose. However, that changed in 1911 when the board of directors, they owned the team, about 8 different owners, the board of directors, they comprised the ownership team. They decided on a new manager. They hired a man named Clark Griffith, who of course would become, his name would go down in baseball history for
Sure,
Washington, of course.
sure.
He came in as manager, and then to give him an incentive to come to Washington, they gave him an option to buy 10% of the team, which he did. So he became one of the board of directors as well. When Griffith came in as manager, his results were instant. Washington finished a surprising second place in 1911, his first year there. However, he had Walter Johnson in his prime. So that helps big time. He had Walter Johnson, was pretty much the whole team. He had a couple other good players, but Walter Johnson was the guy. So they were good when Griffith was there, for 1911, 1912, they were contenders again, 1913. Here was Walter Johnson, 1913, 36 wins. I mean, you couldn't beat this guy. So here they were good for a while. However, as the decade progressed, the Senators, the Nationals, they started going downhill a little bit. And in 1919, they finished 7th. So Griffith got the idea that the only way Washington would ever win a pennant would be, or a world championship, would be if he had complete power, which is why he arranged for a buyout. He bought out the board of directors after the 1919 season. He became co-owner with a man named William Richardson, a businessman who backed him in the transaction and buying the Washington Baseball Club. So they became co-owners. Griffith was president. He ran the team. The other guy, Richardson, he was a businessman. He was more interested in his business, so he kind of stayed out of it. But he let his money ride on Griffith's decisions. Griffith went through a manager a year starting in 1920. After the 1920 season, he stepped down as manager, so he could focus on the day-to-day operations and the operations as team president of the ball club. So he went through a manager year in 1921, 1922. He had a manager year, and then in 1924, he decided on one of his players, Bucky Harris, who was only 27 years old, and his decision was laughed at. You hire a 27-year-old kid who only has 4 full seasons of playing experience. Everyone felt sorry for Harris. He was set to fail, but, Griffith had the last laugh, as you know. They went all the way in 1924, won the pennant, the World Series championship.
Right. So the team was the Senators. Well, the National League team was the Senators. Then they come back, they're the American League team. Ultimately, they're the Nationals, but they're still called the Senators. And I think some reporters or some people refer to them as the Griffs, as in Clark, Griffith. And this team stayed in the American League, ultimately were renamed the Senators later on. I think it was in the 30s or early 40s, somewhere in that range. The Nationals became the Senators, and they stayed in Washington. I think it was about 61. And then they left for Minnesota, became the Twins.
Right.
DC got another team, the Washington Senators. They left, became the Texas Rangers. In 69, baseball expanded with the Seattle Pilots and the oh my gosh, it has the Kansas City Royals in 69 in the American League, the San Diego Padres and the Montreal Expos in the National League. The Pilots, who I did an episode about many episodes ago, only played 1 year in Seattle. They then moved to Milwaukee, became the Milwaukee Brewers. The Expos lasted for quite some time before finally moving to Washington, D.C., where they became these Washington Nationals. So the team that we are actually going to be talking about today is the Minnesota Twins.
They are now the Twins, that's right. And just to fill you in on that, It was after Clark Griffith died in 1955. It was about a year and a half later, they officially changed the name to the Senators. So they were the Senators for the last few years before they moved to Minnesota. And then when the American League expanded in 1961, adding two teams, the Angels and Washington, that team was the Senators.
And they are now the Texas Rangers.
Right.
So, why did well, how should we refer to this team, I guess? Should the team that we're talking about, the 1924 team, the team of destiny, as you call them, and if anybody reads your book, you will see why they are the team of destiny. And I encourage anybody listening or watching to grab a copy of Gary's book, The Team of Destiny, which you do a terrific job in documenting the 1924 season. I don't know how to refer to them. Do I call them the Nationals? Do I call them the Senators? What should we call them today?
I think, you know what? The names were used, Senators and Nationals. They were used interchangeably. I use them interchangeably in my book.
Yeah.
Back then they did as well. So I think we could, at this program, I think we use the names interchangeably.
Okay. Why did this team, until that time, really struggle? What was it that kept them as, for lack of a better term, a second division team? They just struggled to win consistently.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, they were very good when Griffith came to manage, when he came to Washington to manage the Senators or Nationals. You know, they were very good in 1911. They won 91 games, and then they won 90 the following season, and they won close to 90 in 1913. So for a while they were contenders, but then, you know, some of the players got older, and Walter Johnson, you know, was still great, but wasn't as good. And, you know, the team just began to, you know, slowly decline. And, you know, they just didn't have the players. And then in 1920, Walter Johnson, as I pointed out in my book, he sustained his only arm injury of his career. And he was a sore arm pitcher from 1920 through the 1923 season. But in 1924, you know, his arm mysteriously was restored to health, and he had a great season. He won 23 games that year, won the American League MVP. But the reason why they weren't good was because of Walter Johnson's gradual decline and because they just didn't have the players. But, you know, 1924, I mean, they started getting some good players.
Well, before we get to all those good players, I
Yeah.
think what we have to visit first, Gary, is yes, Walter Johnson struggled. You know, in 1919, he was 20 and 14, and then he went 8 and 10, 17 and 14, 15 and 16, 17 and 12. And as we're heading towards the 1924 season, he says, I'm going to give it one last shot and then I'm going to retire. And while this is all happening, Griffith lets go of Washington's manager, Donnie Bush. And I'm not sure at first if he really had a plan in mind as to who he wanted to manage the team, but he ultimately picks, as you said earlier, his young star, Bucky Harris. What kind of ball player was Bucky Harris, and why did Griffith like him so much and make him think, you know, this guy could be a player manager?
Well, Griffith liked him from the start because when Griffith went to scout him in 1919, Harris at the time was playing in Buffalo, and Harris knew he was being scouted, and he had this dream. You know, he was chasing a dream. He wanted to be a big league player. But a few weeks before Griffith saw him, and you know, because he knew he was being scouted, he continued to play with a broken finger. He broke a finger on his throwing hand, and but he continued to play. So Griffith scouted him. When Griffith went to see him play in a doubleheader, Harris went 6 for 6, and he handled all his fielding choices. Then after the game, Harris met him, and he realized, he discovered he had a broken finger. Went 6 for 6 with a broken finger. So Griffith wanted him from the start. And then, so Harris, reported to Washington, and, he played the season with a broken finger until they realized that that finger was broken. They didn't know it at the time, but they realized that finger, they took an X-ray and they found out that finger was broken. And, Harris was on the bench and he protested because he wanted to be in there playing, and he was always a fiery kind of player. So Griffith knew from the start that one day he wanted Harris to manage his ball club, but he wanted Harris to manage after his playing days were done. So heading into the 1924 season, the guy that Griffith wanted was Eddie Collins from the White Sox second baseman. So he tried to swing the deal to get Collins to Washington through a trade, but he couldn't swing the deal, and that's why he ultimately ended up pretty much at the last minute, right before the start of spring training. That's how he ended up hiring Bucky Harris.
So he decides to give Harris a job. And again, as you said earlier, he was only 27 years old and only played in 4 full seasons of Major League Baseball.
Incredible.
Now being tasked to be a player manager at such a young age, you got to figure at least half the team, if not more, is older than Bucky Harris.
Yes.
How did the rest of the team initially react to hearing a 27-year-old, 4-year vet of Major League Baseball is going to run the team?
Harris at first, he was absolutely thrilled that he was offered the job, absolutely excited. He wanted the job so badly. He was so happy to get the job that he didn't even think about the rest of the team. He was just happy. I'm hired as manager. This is great. Then what happened was he left Tampa because that's where he was. He left Tampa to go to Hot Springs because that's where the veterans were. He wanted to join the veterans in training and getting ready for spring training, and they were in Hot Springs. So he was on the train. He's heading to Hot Springs. He started thinking about the team. Then it hit him. What are these guys going to think? Walter Johnson's 36 years old. How is he going to feel about taking orders from a 27-year-old kid? And he really thought about Roger Peckinpaugh because Roger Peckinpaugh was the veteran shortstop, age 33. And Peckinpaugh had managerial experience. He had filled in as Yankees manager, and many thought that Peckinpaugh would get the job. So he was really worried how these guys would react to him. He was really scared. But when he got to Hot Springs, he checked in the hotel, he met the team in the lobby, and he was absolutely thrilled to find out that these guys were happy for him and were willing to work for him, and even told him, Bucky, we're going to work our heads off for you. And then Roger Peckinpaugh was very nice about it. He congratulated Harris, and he was thrilled that Harris had the job. So, that went very well. So Bucky Harris was very relieved when he realized that these guys meant it, that these guys were going to work hard for him.
You got to think, well, first of all, you got to be a good ball player to earn such an honor. He's young, and you got to figure he's got to be likable, at least to some extent. At the same time, Ty Cobb was a player manager for the Tigers during that same time period. And you got to wonder if Cobb was 25, 26, and 27 in that age range and was named the player manager of the Detroit Tigers. Would the rest of the Tiger players been so receptive to the idea that someone who, well, the way we understand it today, was not so well liked on the ball field, would have been so accepted as a player manager?
Yeah, I doubt that Cobb would have been, because even in his veteran years when he was a manager, the players didn't care for him. But you're right, though. Bucky Harris was very well liked because, he was a likable guy and he worked hard. He was a good ball player, and, he played to win. And, he got along with his teammates. So, yes, he was a very likable player, likable person.
Yeah, other guys at the same time that were in the player, a player manager back then was much more common than a player manager is today. Obviously, we don't have any, and it's been quite some time since we've had a player manager, the last couple being probably Pete Rose and Frank Robinson. Um, some of the others at that time, you had Cobb, you had George Sisler of the St. Louis Browns, Dave Bancroft of the Boston Braves, Eddie Collins, who, as you said, Griffith wanted for the National Senators. He was with the White Sox. So Harris is going to become player manager of Washington. And, the team it wasn't a great team. At least it hadn't been a great team. They hadn't really won anything. I don't think many in the American League, National League, Major League Baseball really took this team seriously. What was it about this team that Harris saw, that Griffith saw, and said, we might be able to motivate this team and get this team to gel and catapult them from a second division team into not only a competitive team, but a team that can contend for the American League pennant?
Well, Harris really believed in his heart, even before the season, he really believed in his heart that he had a good team. He really thought this team was going to contend. And, he really believed in them. And, in team meetings, he would talk about winning, talk about championship. So he really believed in them. And he was, a fiery player too. So his disposition kind of rubbed off on the players. But he knew that they were going to be good. There was just no question in his mind. Now, I think one reason why he thought they were going to be contenders was he was counting on Walter Johnson being back, because he knew Walter Johnson had been.
He was back.
Yeah. He knew Walter Johnson had worked out, had been hiking and hunting and, keeping in good shape during the off season. And, he knew Johnson. He just knew that Johnson was going to have a good year. So for one thing that, he had Walter Johnson coming back, but he obviously believed in his players, and he had some good players. I mean, Joe Judge and Sam Rice were with the set. They were veterans. I mean, they were over the age of 30. They were very good ball players, even when Washington wasn't good. They spent their entire careers until the very end with Washington. So he knew he had them. Goose Goslin was an up and coming player. He had a good 1923 season. So that was another player that Bucky Harris knew he could count on to be good. And he also had Roger Peckinpaugh, the veteran shortstop, who was a smooth fielder. And Harris and Peckinpaugh, they were a great double play combination. During the double plays, they could do it better than anybody in the league. So, so having those guys, I mean, gave him a lot of confidence, and having Walter Johnson, return to form, so he knew this team was going to be good. In his heart, he believed they were going to be good.
Yeah, I want to get to some of those players in a moment, but before I get there, I don't want to diminish anything that the Senators accomplished in 24, because moving way far ahead, they won the pennant again, the American League pennant in 25. I mean, they wound up. They were a really good team. But at the time, as we hit the 24 season, was it at all a down year, a down time for the Yankees, the Tigers, the Philadelphia Athletics? Or was it the Senators were just really that good?
Yeah, the Senators were really that good. The Yankees, there's a lot of reasons, back then. There are people who are giving different reasons, about a dozen different reasons why the Yankees didn't win it in 1924. Some people thought they had the best team, and they should have. But, the Senators were just better that year. The Yankees dominated in 1923. I think they finished 10 and a half games ahead of the next best team. The pitchers weren't as good in 1923 for the Yankees. The average shortstop situation, Everett Scott, he was, a great fielding shortstop in his prime, but he was now slowing down. So there were a couple of things, working against the Yankees, but they were still in it. I mean, they were still contenders. They pressed Washington till the end. I think Washington was just better. Detroit was good in 1924. They had a good team. They spent a few days late in the season in first place. They were contenders. They finished 6 games behind Washington in third place. They had a very good hitting team though, and they had a couple good pitchers and good pitching depth. The problem with the Tigers, though, there were a couple problems. Number one, the second baseman situation. They didn't have a reliable second baseman, so that hurt them. And the other thing was Ty Cobb. He was just too intense for them, so that hurt them as well. But they were still a good team. Those teams. So Detroit and New York, they were good teams. They contend throughout the season. They were contenders. They spent most of the season on the heels of the Senators, or ahead of the Senators for that matter. But Washington, the comeback of Walter Johnson and a strong hitting attack and great fielding too. A great fielding infield as well. Really lifted Washington to the top spot in the American League that year.
Well, you mentioned Peckinpaugh, and he was getting up there. He was 33 years old, but he was one of the anchors of the infield, playing shortstop. He had 272 for the season. You had Goose Goslin, and he young guy, 23 years old, but gosh darn it, hit 344, 12 home runs, 129 ribbies. Sam Rice, as you mentioned, playing in the outfield, he was up there, 34 years old. He hit 334. And Joe Judge, who hit 324. But there's three other guys. You had Walter Johnson. There's three other guys that two of whom you talk extensively about throughout the season, and then one who joined the team midway through. So first, let's talk about George Mogridge. Tell us about George, because he was key to this whole thing.
Yeah, he got hot in the second half of the season. He had a very good season, left-hander in his mid-30s, at the tail end of his career, but still he had a very good season. He was a smart pitcher. He was more of a finesse pitcher, not a overpowering pitcher, but he was a smart pitcher. He was a left-hander. He was a good pitcher, and he really came through for Washington that year in 1924. He had one of his best seasons.
Yeah, 16-11, a 3.76 ERA. Another very important starter on that team, Tom Zachary. Tell us about him.
That's very interesting, too, about Tom Zachary, left-handed pitcher who Washington wanted to trade after the 1923 season. It was reported that Washington was willing to listen to any worthwhile offer to trade Zachary. And when the season started, he was in the bullpen, and some people wondered, why. They even asked Harris, why do you even keep this guy on the roster? And Harris said, well, he has some value because he could consistently beat Cleveland and Chicago. So he's got some value. And there was one game where, he started the season. Zachary started the season as a relief pitcher. There was one game against the Yankees, a doubleheader. He sent him to the bullpen to warm up before the second game of the doubleheader. When the Washington fans saw him warming up, they actually booed him. But he became an outstanding. He was outstanding in 1924. He had his best season. He for the first time in his career, he allowed less hits than innings pitched, and he won 2 games in the World Series. So another smart pitcher too, a smart finesse pitcher as well. And
15-9 with a 2.75 ERA. He had a heck of a year.
2 wins in the World Series.
Yeah. Another one, I hope I say his first name right, Firpo Marbury. Now,
Yes.
he was the guy that came out of the pen. He was the relief specialist, as he was their guy. I think he had 15. Yeah, he had 15 saves. He was he started some games, but he was really the rock out of the pen.
Yeah, he was, and he was built for hard work. He was a big, strong, powerful man. And the thing about him is he only had one pitch, which is probably why they used him out of the bullpen. He only had one pitch, the fastball, and he could throw that fastball hard. Now, later in his career, in the late 20s, by the late 1920s, he had developed a curveball. But at that time, in that season, he only had a fastball. And, yeah, I mean, he had a very good fastball. So, opposing batters knew he was coming in with the fastball, but it was a pretty fast fastball, and he was hard to hit. And it was hard to get a hit off of him. And, he was a big difference maker for that team. He was outstanding.
Back to The outfield, Nemo Leibold, he was very important. But the one guy I want to talk about, you tell an interesting story, is a guy that they acquired midway through the season, Earl McNeely. Tell us about Earl, how they found him. Um, they picked him up and he was hurt. And then he really developed into such a key, an integral part of this team.
Yeah, he sure was. Yeah, quite a story. He was right. He was an outfielder for Sacramento in the Pacific Coast League. Now, Washington, one of their weaknesses was center field. They needed a center fielder. They had a couple different guys they tried out in center field. Matthews.
Can I interrupt for one moment? I just want everybody to understand that the Pacific Coast League, we would think of the PCL today as a triple A league. Back then, it was almost a second major league. I mean, there was some great talent in the PCL.
Mhm. Yeah, there sure was. It was an outstanding league. Some people refer to it as a third major league. It was so talented. And Earl McNeely was playing in Sacramento, and he was playing very well. But Washington needed a center fielder. They tried a couple guys. Wid Matthews was one guy they tried who was pretty good. He's a good hitter. He was fiery. He fired up the team, but he had a weak throwing arm, so he was a liability. So they tried Nemo Leibold, the former Chicago White Sox outfielder, who played for the famous Black Sox, but he was one of the clean Sox. He played to win. He ended up in Washington, and the Senators thought that he was pretty good, but they thought he was no better than a reserve, no better than a number 4 outfielder. So they weren't really comfortable with him being the everyday outfielder. So they needed a center fielder, and they wanted a right-handed hitter because they had plenty of lefties in the starting lineup. So they wanted a right-handed hitter. Joe Engel, he was the one-man scouting crew for the Washington Senators. He started scouting the minor leagues for a right-handed hitting outfielder. He went to the Pacific Coast. He found Earl McNeely. He arranged for the purchase of Earl McNeely to join the Senators. Now, little did Engel or the Senators know that just a few days before he joined the Senators, Earl McNeely sustained a shoulder injury. So he was hurt. He had a bruised shoulder. So he couldn't even lift up his arm because he was in so much pain. But however, the Senators didn't know this, so they went ahead with the acquisition of McNeely. So he took a train from the West Coast, joined the Senators in Chicago, and the first thing when he arrived in Chicago, he went to the hotel, went right to Griffith's room. Griffith said to him, he met him, he knocked on the door. Griffith opened the door. I'm Earl McNeely, Griffith said, "Nice to meet you. You're the guy I paid all the money for. Well, it's nice to finally meet you." And he extended his hand to shake his hand. And McNeely said, "Sorry, I can't lift my arm past my shoulder. I injured my shoulder a few days ago." So Griffith, when he heard this, he wanted to call off the deal. However, an examination of McNeely revealed that he was okay to play and he could play, and the injury was just a bruise and it'll probably heal in a few days. So sure enough, they put McNeely in the lineup right away. And like you say, yeah, he paid off big time. He hit 330 for him. He played well, played good defense for them. He hit well, and he turned out to be a very good acquisition for the Senators.
To be a good team, to be, stating the obvious, not only do you have to have great frontline talent, you got to have great bench talent.
Yeah.
And that's what the Senators had. So the season, McNeely joins the team midway through the season, and the Senators are are a decent team. They're contending. They're not a second division team. At what point during this season did the rest of the American League start taking Washington serious? Like, hey, they might actually be pretty good.
Well, they first noticed Washington in late June. They put together a winning streak. They won 19 out of 20 games, or maybe it was 19 out of 21 games, but they had the winning streak. At the end of June, with the winning streak, they went into New York to play the Yankees in a 4-game series with the Yankees in first place by a couple of games. And the Senators at Yankee Stadium swept all 4 games to move into first place. So that's when others started taking notice that, hey, these guys might be for real. However, not everybody was convinced. A lot of people thought Washington, well, just wait and see. They're going to crack. Washington's going to crack. A lot of people believe that. Just wait and see. They took that what just wait and see kind of attitude. And sure enough, well, they entered July. They began July on a high note. They won. I believe they swept the Red Sox, or they won 4 out of 5 from the Red Sox or something. So, and then they took the Athletics. So they continued to play good in early July. But then the Yankees came to town, and the Yankees in a 5-game series took 4 out of 5. And then the Tigers came to town.
Yeah,
And
the Senators lost like 6 games in a row.
yeah, and suddenly by the end of July, here they were in third place, or they're actually in second place. And then they went to St. Louis in August, where it was so hot, it was hard to focus on baseball, and they got swept in a 5-game series, and then they fell into third place. So everyone thought they were done for, but they got hot. And
But how did Bucky keep this team together at that point? They lost 6 in a row. They dropped to third place. How does a young guy like Bucky Harris, who really hasn't been in a pennant race, how does he keep this team together? Who are his sergeants, his coaching staff? How does he keep this team together and stop them from completely falling apart?
well, he kept talking about winning, and he kept talking about championship, and he fired him up that way. And he had, Walter Johnson kept winning, because Walter Johnson went on a 13-game winning streak, hadn't lost a game since I think it was July 11th, and he kept winning. Every time Walter Johnson, we've got Walter Johnson, he's going to continue to win for you guys, he told them. So, he kept them fired up, and he kept them believing in themselves, and they kept playing hard and hustling, and they kept winning. And they started winning after the slump in early August. They started winning, and then what happened was they moved back into second place. They were on the heels of the Yankees, and they went to Yankee Stadium to play the Yankees in a 4-game series to finish out the month of August. And they took 3 out of 4 to move back into first place. So they entered September. Here they were in first place. That's when everybody realized that Washington was definitely for real and might win the American League pennant. And not only that, people were so thrilled by this because the Yankees and the Giants in the National League, they had won every pennant and met in 3 consecutive World Series. They had won every pennant since 1921. And it looked like, people didn't want to see 1924. People did not, they were tired of an all New York World Series. They wanted to see it change. So the whole country was pulling for this.
Yeah. There was even the players. A guy like Babe Ruth said, "Well, if it can't be us, it might as well be Washington." Right?
Yeah, that's unbelievable. But even in Philadelphia in September, when they started September, the month of September, they're in first place, and they go to Philadelphia, and Bucky Harris hits a home run, and he rounds the bases. The Philadelphia infielders are actually congratulating him, patting him on the back, shaking his hand. So that's unbelievable. But yeah, that's the way it was. Everyone was pulling for Washington. First of all, because they were an underdog and it was so unexpected, and also because of Walter Johnson. Everyone wanted to see Walter.
Yeah, I want to get to that. I want to get to that. Before we get there, though, I do have this other question for you. The game of baseball has changed dramatically, obviously, but even from a scheduling standpoint, you really don't have doubleheaders scheduled anymore. Doubleheaders were a part of the game, a big part of the game. But back then they were even a bigger part of the game. And one of the things that struck me was all the double headers that the Senators played, a lot of it due to weather. How does did did could the Senators have been even better? I mean, how did the double headers, having so many of them, affect this team?
Mhm. Yeah, well, it was hard because it was, kind of frightful for Washington because they didn't have a lot of pitching depth, and Harris was basically going with the same 4 or 5 pitchers day after day, especially down the stretch. So it was tiring, and That was also why Griffith and Harris elected not to. Back then, teams, major league teams, as they would travel, they'd play an exhibition game during the season in a small town against a minor league team. But that's why Griffith and Harris, because they wanted to save the team for these double headers and for the pressure down the stretch. That's why they did not schedule these exhibition games. And it was all,
Right. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yes, you were saying
yeah,
that when teams would travel,
yeah.
it was different, right? You didn't have airplanes. They traveled by train or bus, whatever it was. Along the way, they would stop and play an exhibition game. The Senators didn't do this. I think they played one.
Yeah, they played one in Bucky Harris's hometown of Pittston, Pennsylvania. Yeah, that was one that they just had to play. I mean, it was his hometown. Everyone in his hometown wanted to see him. So that was one they went with. Yeah, so they went with that one, but they didn't play any other exhibition games because, plain and simple, they just wanted to reserve the strength of the team for the league games. And here they were battling in a pennant. So, they needed every ounce of strength, every ounce of rest they can get.
What was the benefit to the teams to playing those exhibition games? Was there any benefit to them? Did they make extra money? What was the benefit?
Yeah, it was, yeah, I mean, it was about giving fans the opportunity who wouldn't get to see them, giving fans the opportunity to see them. And yeah, making money. Yeah, they make some extra money, right? For sure. But other than that, there really wasn't that much benefit other than the fact that you're giving these small towns a chance to see a Major League Baseball team up close and in person.
Back to Bucky. Again, 27 years old, player manager, has taken on this incredible role. How did it actually affect his play?
Mhm. Yeah, he still played hard there. People were worried about that, especially during the exhibition season, spring training. He was making some throwing errors. But for Harris, I mean, he was fiery. He was a competitor. If anything, it made him maybe even stronger. He had a good year at the plate, and he still did the job defensively. I mean, if anything, it made him more intense. It made him more he wanted to come through, show his team the way, and he liked that kind of pressure too. He wanted to be at the plate, with the winning run on base, or in the field when they needed a double play, or or if they needed a play, period, in the field or on the base pass or whatever. I mean, Harris liked that. He loved that. So he didn't mind the extra responsibility.
You sort of alluded to this just before, and and I think it was somewhat of a theme in your book was the career of Walter Johnson. And the one thing that came to mind, and I'm not so sure you would see it today, but it sounded like almost everyone was pulling for Walter Johnson to finally make it to a World Series. I mean, one of the greatest pitchers of his time, in one of the greatest pitchers in the history of the game. But he never had the opportunity to play in a World Series. So why would fans from other teams care whether or not Walter Johnson got to play in a World Series? It was just a different time? Was baseball different? Talk about that.
Well, Walter Johnson was not only a great pitcher who pitched his entire career for the Washington Senators, and before the 1924 season, when he announced that this would be his last year, people felt bad that he'd be the greatest player, not only pitcher, but probably the greatest player to never get to play in a World Series game. So that was one reason. But Walter Johnson, too, as I pointed out in my book, was just such a sportsman, such a nice guy, had so many friends around baseball. The fans loved him. They just wanted to see Walter Johnson, get his chance, not only for being a great player, but just for being such a wonderful individual, for being such a nice guy. They wanted to see Walter Johnson get his chance.
I guess it would be the more modern times, the Ernie Banks or I guess even maybe a guy like Don Mattingly. These guys were great ball players who never got to appear in a World Series, a postseason game. And so Johnson, now he's 36 years old and, he's won over 300 games. Of course, baseball, again, different back then. Pitchers pitched more complete games, went deeper into games. But he really did have a heck of a season. I mean, it was going to be his last, and he finished the year 23 and 7, 2.72 ERA, 6 shutouts, 20 complete games, he threw 277 and 2/3 innings. Talk about his season as a whole. He's coming off an arm injury. How does he do this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is amazing. And yes, he had the arm injury. He spent the year though. It was interesting. He spent the off season, the winter, doing a lot of hiking, walking over hills, and he really what he wanted to do is goal. He wasn't really sure about his arm, but in 1923, his legs went bad, so he really wanted to strengthen his legs. He missed time in 1923 because of a leg injury. So his goal was to strengthen his legs. So what was amazing to him though was that by working to strengthen his legs, he was able to restore his arm to full health. He said that he had a knot in his pitching arm. He said it was a strange knot by his elbow, very peculiar knot, and he couldn't understand, how he had it, but it was hampering his pitching. And he said that knot, as each season developed, it first appeared in 1920, and as each season passed by, the knot became smaller. And in 1924, that knot had completely disappeared. And he strengthened his legs, and he was in great shape. So a combination of all these things restored his arm to his pitching to 100%. I mean, he was a great pitcher that year, and he was able to do it by strengthening his legs and by, finally getting rid of that bothersome knot he had. And that's amazing. But he knew, going into that season, he knew he was going to have a good season, and he was expecting to win 20. So it was no surprise to him that he had such a good season. He knew he was going to have a good year, and he knew he had it in him, and he knew even though he was older, he still knew he could pitch in the American League, and he could still win 20 games. And little did he know he'd win the MVP that year.
Yeah, I mean, and then he pitched 3 more years, and following year 25, he won 20 games. Talk about how exciting it was around Washington, D.C. during this season. I mean, people were lined up on the streets looking at the ticker tape or whatever, the ticker outside of the newspapers. Some fans would travel with the team to see them play at the stadium. I mean, a pennant race in Washington, D.C., this was something they weren't used to. Talk about the excitement, and especially in September as the race heated up.
Yeah, it was really quite a roller coaster season for the Washington fans because you go back to 1924, the beginning of the year. This is January, February. Now, at that time, Washington, they're coming off a losing record. 1923, they had more losses than wins. So they didn't have a winning season in 1923. They made no trades, no roster moves heading into the 1924 season, and they didn't have a manager in place as well. So you're talking about January, February, a reporter from one of the Washington newspapers, he went out and he interviewed fans. He went to Capitol Hill to interview some politicians. So he did a full interview of Washington baseball fans. And his conclusion was, he did a full study. His conclusion was Washington baseball enthusiasm was at an all-time low. I mean, everybody wasn't into it. Nobody was into it. And people are expecting another losing season. I mean, you make no roster moves for a team that didn't win the previous year, and you don't have a manager in place. So, how good of a season could this possibly be? Well, it's probably going to be another losing season, they're thinking. So then they finally hired Harris, and then came opening day. So some of that enthusiasm was restored. Opening day was a sold-out crowd, and Walter Johnson pitched a shutout. So that kind of got the fans, their hopes up a little bit, but that was only temporary because the team didn't get off to a good start. They got off to a slow start under Harris. It took a while for Harris's enthusiasm actually to actually get the team going. So they got off to a slow start, and then they have all these rainouts too. And they had a terrible storm in the month of May in Washington. So here you have. There's good reason why why the city is not into the team. And then all of a sudden, when the team started winning, now enthusiasm was installed. In June, after they swept the Yankees at Yankee Stadium, 4-game series, they came back to Washington to play the Phillies, play the Athletics in a doubleheader. So now enthusiasm, is at an all-time high in Washington. Everybody's out to see Washington play in June and into July. Everybody's into it now. So suddenly the fans are really into it, and then they go into the slump in August. So the fans, are unsure now. They don't think they're going to do it. They had all these hopes, in June and July that maybe this could be the year, but now in August, they weren't so enthused, but then they get hot at the end of August and they take 3 out of 4 Yankee Stadium. So now Washington baseball fans, enthusiasm was at an all-time high. They start getting these big attendances, and their last home game of the year is 30,000 fans, jam-packed in the small Griffith Stadium. So, now the crowd is really into it. And when they finish the season on the road, the last 20 games of the season is on the road, everybody's following the team the best way they could back then. There are no televisions, there's no play-by-play on the radio, so you had to find other ways to follow the team. The newspapers were the most popular way to follow the team when they were on the road. Other things were the electronic scoreboards, which would post play-by-play results at street corners. That was another way fans could follow their team. And then there actually was radio, but that was more of a batter-by-batter account, not play-by-play. So less people went to the radios. More people went to the newspapers and the electronic scoreboards than they did the radios.
I don't think there's one game look, baseball's a long season, 154 games back then. I don't think there's really one game that you can pinpoint that said, yeah, this is where they turn their season around. But what you can do is talk about the adversity that this team faced throughout the season. And they overcame it. And they win the American League pennant. And now they have to face the New York Giants in the World Series. And not many gave the Senators or the Nationals much of a chance to win the series, especially going down 2-1. They lose the first game of the World Series in Washington. They win the second game of the World Series, so it's 1-1 going to New York, and then the Giants win game 3 to go up 2-1, and Walter Johnson lost game 1. They come back, jumping ahead. They win game 4, so it's 2-2. Johnson loses game 5. It is such a sad thing because, as we said, people wanted to see Johnson win a World Series. Now he finally gets into the World Series and he's 0-2. The Nationals are down 3-2. It's like, this is impossible for them to come back. How upset was everybody that Johnson was 0-2 in the World Series?
Yeah, people felt sorry for him because they really wanted to see Johnson win a World Series game because that was his career-long dream, his lifelong dream, was to pitch a win in a World Series game. And before the season started, of course, nobody thought Washington would do it, and nobody thought Walter Johnson would ever get a chance to pitch in a World Series. So now he finally gets the chance to pitch in a World Series, and people wanted to see him win. People poured in their support through letters and telegrams, sending him to Walter Johnson, telling him how much they wanted him to win, how they were pulling for him. And Walter Johnson wanted to come through for them, but like you said, yeah, he lost game one in 12 innings, extra innings. He pitched all 12 innings through 165 pitches, and he was a tough luck loser in game one. And then he comes back in game five and he lost again. And since game six was going to be the next day and game seven was the day after, it was pretty much certain that Walter Johnson was done for the year, that he would get a chance to pitch in another game that year, that he wouldn't get a chance to pitch in a World Series game. So people were really disappointed because they really wanted to see him win, but I don't think anyone was more disappointed than Walter Johnson was, because not only did he want to win for himself, but he wanted to win for these many fans who poured in their love and support for him and told him they were pulling for him. He really wanted to win for them. So he felt terrible about that. He was just devastated after losing that game.
Yeah, before we get to games 6 and 7, I do want to go back. I forgot about this. The Senators had a pretty big fan and his wife, President Calvin Coolidge. Talk about how much they love this team, particularly his wife.
Yeah, unlike the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, the First Lady, Grace Coolidge, knew a lot about baseball. She had followed baseball since her childhood. She knew how to keep score. You know, she'd go to the games and she'd keep score, keep a scorecard. So she knew she knew a lot about the game. And, you know, she grew up in New England, so naturally she was a Red Sox fan. But when she came to Washington, you know, with the excitement of the Senators and, you know, and the Senators finally winning and Walter Johnson, Bucky Harris, she instantly became a Washington Senators baseball fan. So, yeah, she was a huge fan, and she pulled hard for the team. And, you know, she tuned into the game. She listened on the White House radio to games 3, 4, and 5, which were played in New York. You know, so she followed the team throughout the course of the season as well. So, you know, she was a huge fan. Yeah, she was a big-time baseball fan. And after her husband's presidency, when they moved back to New England, she continued to follow the Red Sox. She kept track of the Senators. She liked Clark Griffith a lot, but she turned back to becoming a Red Sox fan. So after the presidency, she was back to rooting for the Red Sox. And, you know, when I was doing my research, I was at the Coolidge Library, and I went through some old letters, and I found a letter from 1955 from Grace Coolidge. You know, she wrote to a friend, "Dear friend, I don't know if you heard, but last week Clark Griffith died." You know, so she followed the Senators, followed the team, you know. You know, she was a baseball fan her whole life.
Well, it's 3 games to 2 in favor of the Giants. They're coming back to Washington. Um, and the guy who you said had one of the best, if not the best season of his career, Tom Zachary, goes out and wins game 6. So it's now 3-3. He pitched in 2 games. He won them both.
Yes.
You know, this season, the 1924 season for the Washington Senators, really became the story of Bucky Harris and Walter Johnson, particularly Johnson, because this is going to be his last year. And like we said, he lost both of his World Series starts. So sadly, not only is he not going to, most likely not going to have a World Series victory uh, um, under his belt, he's not going to win a world championship, right? He's not going to win a World Series. His great career is going to be void of both of those things. But he had the last laugh. Tell us about Game 7 and Johnson's ultimate victory.
Well, Game 7 was probably one of the greatest games in World Series history, maybe even baseball history. The series is, like you said, it's tied 3 games to 3, and the Giants are going to play the Senators in Washington, the 7th and deciding game. So Harris had a plan. You know, John McGraw and the Giants, they had a lot of depth, and they had so much depth that McGraw had a lineup that hit against, you know, left-handed batting lineup to face right-handed pitchers, and had a right-handed batting lineup to face left-handed pitchers. So for game 7, what Harris did was he started a right-hander, Curly Ogden, who hadn't pitched in the series and had a sore arm, but he started him because his plan was he wanted McGraw to start his left-handed hitting lineup, particularly Bill Terry, the first baseman, the Hall of Fame first baseman, who was having a great series and was destroying Washington right-handed pitching. But Harris wanted to get Terry out of the game. So he started a right-hander, Curly Ogden, and Curly Ogden faced two batters. And after he faced the second batter, which he walked, Harris brought in George Mogridge, a left-handed pitcher. So a few innings later, Bill Terry went up against Mogridge, and he went hitless. He faced him twice and went hitless against him. So in the fifth inning, when he was due to bat a third time against Mogridge, McGraw lifted Terry for a pinch hitter. So Harris's plan worked. He got Terry out of there. So Mogridge continued to pitch, and then he eventually replaced Mogridge with another pitcher, Fred Marbury, a right-handed pitcher. So the game was tied after 8 innings. Actually, the Giants took a 3-1 lead, and they led 3-1 heading into the bottom of the 8th, and the Senators rallied for 2 runs in the bottom of the 8th to tie the game 3-3. So here we are in Game 7. We're tied after 8 innings, 3-3. And in the bottom of the 8th, as Washington rallied for 2 runs, everybody was aware that Harris had lifted the pitcher for a pinch hitter. So that meant in the top of the 9th, Washington would have a new pitcher on the mound. So who was on the mound to start the top of the 9th? None other than Walter Johnson. Came on in relief to pitch the top of the 9th. Everybody is thrilled by the sight of Walter Johnson because this meant that Walter Johnson would get a chance to pitch possibly another win, another chance to pitch a win in the World Series. So that was great. So that thrilled everybody. Well, Johnson retired the first batter he faced in the top of the 9th, but then the next batter hits a triple. It's a triple against Johnson. So now you got a New York Giant base runner on third, only 1 out. And you got the number 3, 4, and 5 hitters coming up. So, poor Walter Johnson, it looked like it was going to happen to him again. Here he was, another chance to pitch a possible World Series win, but now it looks like he's going to lose another game. Poor Walter Johnson. It looked like it just wasn't meant to be. Well, lo and behold, Johnson retires the next 2 batters, gets out of the jam. So the game goes to the bottom of the 9th. However, the Senators don't score. So here you are, Game 7 is now going into extra innings. So the 10th inning, Walter Johnson got into another jam, and sure enough, he got out of it. Washington doesn't score in the bottom of the 10th, so the game goes into the 11th. And then into the 12th inning, Walter Johnson again pitches through the top of the 12th. He pitches through another inning. So now it's the bottom of the 12th, and it's 3-3. And Washington has another chance to win the game, win it for Walter Johnson. However, they have the numbers 7, 8, and 9 hitters due up in the lineup. So it looks like, especially after the number 7 hitter, the leadoff hitter in the inning makes it out, it looks like the game's going to go into 13 innings. And Babe Ruth, he's among the press. He's covering the games as a syndicate writer, and he's in the press box shaking his head. And he says, I don't think Walter Johnson could pitch another shutout inning. He's just pitched 4. He's 36 years old. He just pitched 4 consecutive shutout innings. He just pitched 2 days ago. I don't think he's going to win this game. So it doesn't look good for Washington, especially because there's 1 out in the bottom of the 12th. And Muddy Rule, the catcher, who only has 1 hit in the World Series, he's 1 for 20, I believe, is at the plate. And he hits a pop fly right above home plate. And everyone in the crowd just groans because it looks like here's going to be out number 2, right? So Hank Gowdy was the catcher for the Giants, a seasoned veteran, hero of the 1914 World Series when he was with the Braves. Now he's about to become the World Series GOAT because what he does, Hank Gowdy, is he gets under the pop fly, the pop fly. He's going to probably catch the ball. And what he does, instead of throwing his mask out of the way, he drops it right in front of him. The result is he steps on his mask, he stumbles, he flat out misses the ball for an error. So Muddy Rule goes as an error. Muddy Rule gets another chance, and sure enough, on the next pitch, he hits a double down the left field line. So now there's a runner on second, only 1 out. Walter Johnson's the batter. He hits a routine grounder to the shortstop, and the shortstop boots it. So Walter Johnson gets on base. So now it's first and second, only 1 out, and Earl McNeely, the rookie I spoke about, recently called up, purchased from Sacramento, right, of the Pacific Coast League, is at the plate, a rookie. So he hits a ground ball, and his at-bat, he hits a ground ball right towards the third baseman, Fred Lindstrom. It looks like it's going to be an inning-ending double play for sure. It's just totally routine, just a simple play. Lo and behold, once you know it, the ball hits, I believe it hit a pebble. It bounces over the third baseman, Freddie Lindstrom, bounces over his head, rolls into the left field. Here's Muddy Rule, the slowest player in the American League on second base. Well, he rounds third, and he's heading home. And, since he's slow and, because of the anticipation and everything, it seems like it takes him forever to get to home plate. But he does get to home plate. He crosses home plate with the winning run. Washington wins 4-3. And best of all, Walter Johnson is credited with the win. Walter Johnson is the winning pitcher in Game 7 of the 1924 World Series.
He wins the World Series. He gets a win as he's the winning pitcher, wins the World Series, and he had a key at bat in the bottom of the 12th as well. What a storybook ending to a spectacular season. So, the epilogue to this story is it was a phenomenal year for Bucky Harris and Walter Johnson, and of course, the Washington Senators. So let's end it here. How important in baseball, in Washington, D.C., baseball history was this 2-year run for the legacies of Walter Johnson and Bucky Harris? And what, if anything, does the 24 World Series championship mean today, if anything at all, for the city of Washington, D.C.?
Well, Washington, D.C. has only won 2 Major League World Series championships, 2019, the Nationals winning it in 1924. So, and it's the only World Series the Washington Senators ever won. So, yes, it means a lot to the city of Washington to have that as part of their baseball history. So, absolutely wonderful that Washington's had it. Absolutely important, and certainly very important for the legacy of Bucky Harris to be a boy manager, to be a rookie manager, to overcome the odds, to do what nobody thought he could do, that nobody thought Washington could do, to win a World Series, like that. And for Walter Johnson to finally get to pitch a World Series victory. Now, you go back to the World Series the next year and he'd win twice in the World Series, but the anticipation in 1924 was he was going to retire after that season. So certainly a very important win for Walter Johnson.
Well, Gary, I want to thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Again, your book, Team of Destiny, Walter Johnson, Clark Griffith, Bucky Harris, and the 1924 Washington Senators. I encourage everybody to go out, pick up a copy. I'm sure you can get it wherever you get your books. Terrific read. Gary, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Anytime. In 1925, the Senators, or Nationals, finished in first place for a second straight year with a record of 96 wins, 55 losses, and 1 tie, 8.5 games ahead of the second-place Philadelphia Athletics. However, Washington fell just short in the World Series, losing the last 2 games to the Pittsburgh Pirates to fall 4-3. Walter Johnson went 2-1 in that series after posting a record of 20-7 during the regular season. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest today, author Gary Sarnoff, and thanks to all of you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.